So in governance, risk, and compliance, we'll be looking at what mission, vision, goals, and objectives of the organization. What do they mean, and how do they tie in with governance, risk, and compliance? We'll be looking at management measures and reporting, and how some of that is done in the organization. And then we will be looking at rules, laws, and how those are applied as part of GRC. So without further ado, what is GRC? So the textbook definition of GRC is that it's an organization-wide objective for improving governance and understanding the impact of risk on business performance and ensuring effective compliance. Now, what does all of this mean? This is a lot of garbled. So I thought I'll give you a quick example, and I feel that this example actually hits home quite well. Cold October morning, all of Wall Street was called to a ballroom in Manhattan for a meeting. The agenda of the meeting was change of guard, as in Alcoa, which is aluminum company of America, was changing its CEO. Alcoa has been responsible for some great innovations in the aluminum space. So, you know those wrappers that you get around chocolates and all of that were innovated by Alcoa as a company. But in the recent history of their organization, they've been seeing some struggles, and therefore, they decided to switch the CEO. So everyone was called, the who's who. Alcoa was a billion-dollar company at the time. There were investors who had invested millions of dollars in Alcoa. So there were the who's who of Wall Street who had come to this ballroom, and as the day proceeded and the previous management stepped out, Paul O'Neill was the newly elected or newly selected CEO. He was not a Wall Street guy. Nobody in Wall Street knew him. He was absolutely new to the investment banking side of the world. A lot of people saw him as a bureaucrat. They were really not sure what Alcoa was getting. And considering that their recent history was so bad and they were losing market share, etc., they were hoping it was somebody who was a proper CEO. He looked the part, but nobody knew him. So eventually, at some point, he, walked up the stage, got onto the podium, and started speaking. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I want to talk to you about worker safety." Wall Street was shocked. They were like, "What? We need a CEO who's going to talk, who's going to talk the script, right? Quarter-on-quarter growth. How are we going to get that? Year-on-year growth. How are we going to get that? How are we going to manage inventory? How are we going to get into new businesses? The aerospace industry needs aluminum. How are we going to address that? We want a CEO who's going to talk about all of these things." And this joker walks up, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I want to talk to you about worker safety." And he went on and on about worker safety, and he even told people, "Look, there are exits, at the back of the room, like a true stewardess or steward in the aeroplane." Now, why I bring this story to your attention is because it very interestingly ties up all of these things. You see, one, spoiler alert, Paul O'Neill was one of the most successful CEOs in American history of its time. Alcoa grew 5x during his leadership. While Alcoa had, obviously a vision of becoming, the largest aluminum manufacturer in the country, their mission was rejigged by Paul O'Neill. And one of the things that he made his pet project was worker safety. And he said he wanted to make his organization a zero injury organization. Zero injury organization. He said Alcoa will be a zero injury organization. And you see, this is what enterprise assurance means. You see, this is the level at which mission, vision, goals are, etched into the company. I don't know how many of us has ever tried to understand from senior leadership what exactly is our mission. How it's okay to have a vision that we want to be a $10 billion company, $50 billion company. All these visions are okay, but how we are going to get there is the mission. And Paul O'Neill made one of his missions to become a zero injury company. And that is the mission. All policies, procedures, controls, executive monitoring are all revolving around this zero injury policy. Now, of course, it took Wall Street a while to realize why he was so keen on zero injury policy and worker safety. He was not a humanitarian. He didn't come from UN or any NGO or whatnot. He was a pure-blooded businessman. But the reason why he focused on this was he believed that if I can create a zero injury business, that too in manufacturing, in aluminum, where people work in 1,500 degrees centigrade kind of environment, I can directly relate that to productivity. For those of us who watch football, you realize every time somebody tackles and then there's all this melodrama. There's such a big stoppage to what happens in that organization called football, right? Everything changes. The opponents are not in the same place anymore. The guys who have the ball are not in the same place anymore. Everything needs to be kickstarted again. It's the same thing in a company when there are injuries, accidents. All of these things actually create a number of problems. They create productivity issues. They create reputational issues. They create many different things. Also, when you start focusing on zero injury as your mission, you start creating certain controls in the organization that directly impact quality and control. And you will see that as we try and map this example to what GRC really means to an organization. So, like I said, when Paul O'Neill stood up there and he said zero injury organization, this is what he meant. This is what his enterprise is showing, which means that you could actually gauge him among the other things that you actually measure how well Paul O'Neill did. One measure was very simple. Was it a zero injury organization during that quarter? Right? Now, that trickles down to the GRC management folks who then look at this and they say, okay, let me create policies around this. What are those policies? So, I should have exit doors. I should have this. I should have that. I should have so many different things that ensure that my workers are safe. But it also means, on the one side, while you create these physical controls, it also means you create people controls. So, for example, a slightly far-fetched but related example would be I would now need to create role-based access control so that I ensure that the right skilled person is operating the right machine. And previously, that was not happening. And when that starts happening, you start having efficiencies in each of those roles and the groups that perform those roles. So that is the kind of policies and procedures and compliance management that you start doing when you have that one solitary goal in mind, which is zero injury company. At the same time, your loss and investigation management also improves because then you start looking at, when I was having all these problems, what was happening, and now when I have actually started putting in systems, people, procedures, and process in place, what has really changed? And when a problem occurs, how do I handle this now? Previously, it was, maybe call 911. Now it meant that you had to actually look back at each of the controls and find out which controls failed because of which you actually had an injury and therefore, tripped your own goal for that quarter. Now, obviously, all of this is done by the operations team and the people who do analytics. So, they start looking at, okay, what are all those various data points that we need to collect, and therefore, create reports and analytics around it so that we can then go back to the senior management folks and tell them, hey, look, what? This is what happened this month. This is the kind of problems happened. And therefore, this is why, we need to change certain controls or change certain processes or change certain. And finally, technology. And this is why it is very important for all of us to understand that GRC is not a technology project. And that is why it is an organization-wide objective. It is not just for some technical people to put some enterprise risk management system in place, right? Technology is the means to the end. Like I said, one thing that you may do is start having rule-based access control. To ensure that the right skilled people are operating the right machinery. Therefore, you reduce accidents, you reduce unskilled laborers doing something that they shouldn't be doing. But that technology is merely just, it is a means to the end. It is an enabler. So it comes right at the bottom. So this is how you look at the GRC model. So any questions on this GRC model before I proceed? So we looked at why we need GRC, and see, at the end of the day, yes, textbooks will tell you, effective decision making reduce cost, etc. But then if you take it back to what Paul O'Neill said on that first day, and he said zero injury company, right? Then you start seeing what this really means if you can govern this mission, identify the risks, and create compliance around it. It will definitely reduce cost as it improves your productivity. It will improve efficiencies as you start ensuring that workers are doing the things that they should be doing without worrying about injuries and accidents. And you can make effective decision making because then you know exactly why there are some controls going wrong and what are those controls and why you need to change them. And of course, it protects business value in a lot of ways because when you are able to go out there and tell people you are a zero injury company, that in itself gives you an ethical, moral high ground that perhaps no other company can stand up. So on that October morning, several investors had actually started walking around Wall Street saying, sell Alcoa as soon as you can. And they came back a year later and said that was the greatest blunder they'd done as investment bankers to their own clients. So we will use this example whenever we can, and we will map things to it, and we will now proceed to IT audits. But any questions, meanwhile? All right. So IT audits, I think the idea here is to again just quickly run through information technology audits. We obviously look at while GRC is an organization-wide activity, this is suddenly dropped focus to IT audits, but which is okay. We have to remember that we are focusing on information here and the technology that is used for information, for management of information. So typically these technologies can be, for those of us who are not into IT, typically you can group these under applications, databases, servers, and networks. Basically your applications could be things like SAP, they could be things like Salesforce, it could also be on-premise applications that you may be using. Databases could be, RDBMS like Oracle. There are also more complex databases that are being used today. So, but they're basically your data stores. Servers are, those machines in racks that are sitting somewhere that provide computing resources to all of us. In case of organizations that don't use cloud, you would probably have a data center somewhere where you could actually see this. In case of companies that use cloud, we don't know where these servers are. They're, somewhere there. They're omnipresent. Networks obviously allow us to connect with each other and share resources. And all of these elements need to be audited in order to ensure that systems are compliant. So what exactly is an IT audit, right? So it is an examination and evaluation of an organization's information technology infrastructure. So that's a very important point there. It is only about the information technology infrastructure. And all of these information technology infrastructure are used for gathering, storing, processing, distributing, decision of information. So whatever you can do with information, these are all within these elements of infrastructure, and these are the ones that need to be audited. The reason why these IT audits are important is because we are in 2022, and today every company is a tech company. It doesn't matter what you're doing, but if you have not adopted technology to enable you in that business, then you are not going to last. It doesn't matter if you're a food company, if you're an automobile company, but if you don't identify yourself as a tech company, your general ability to compete in the not even very distant future is going to be very, very limited. And therefore, as a tech company, we store tons of information. All of that information needs to be compliant with both laws and regulations of the land and policies of the land. When I say policy of the company, I'm referring to something like what Paul O'Neill said, where he said zero injury company. That's a policy of the company, right? No law or regulation is asking you to do that. So types of audits. So you typically have, three types of audits overall. And again, without going into too much detail in all of this, and we can have subsequent conversations. So there is internal audit, where an organization within the company is auditing independently all the various controls that have been placed in the company. So if we go back to the Paul O'Neill place, it means that to the Paul O'Neill example, it means that there is an independent company that is making sure that every manufacturing unit of Alcoa is adhering to the zero injury policy, which means that if they go there, they can then see from a physical infrastructure perspective, they have all that needs to be in order for it to be a zero injury company. From a technology perspective, they have everything that needs to be there for it to be a zero injury company. Financial statement audit is slightly different. Financial statement audit audits the systems and technologies that provide inputs that generate financial systems, financial statements that go to the market. And each of these systems need to have controls, and those controls need to be evaluated. What I mean by that is, so for example, you may have a very clean financial statement, but if you look back into the system, for example, separation of duties may not have actually been implemented, which means that the guy who's actually raising the invoice is also the guy who's processing the invoice, and is also the guy who's approving the invoice. Therefore, you have invoices which are all raised, processed, and approved, but they may not all be good invoices. And you can only find out if you actually look at the underlying tech which was generating all of that data and see if there are controls placed in that technology in order for these financial statements to be kosher. Attestation engagements are where you audit third parties, which is vendors, for example. So you're attesting to them being in line with policies that you need for your organization, right? Now, what are IT controls? So it's a checkpoint. So, for example, in our Paul O'Neill example, does the application use role-based access control, or does it use regular IAM? Is a checkpoint. You could actually look at a system, look at how identity and access management is done in that system, and then say, hey, this doesn't actually use your role-based access control, which means that you may not be able to separate people into groups, which means you will never be able to say that people of certain skills can operate certain machinery and people of other skills will operate certain other machinery. So it is merely a checkpoint that provides assurance that this technology can be used in a reliable manner and will be compliant with either the organization's policies as well as the laws and regulations of that. So you create audit objectives. Those audit objectives, each of those audit objectives will have control objectives, and each of those control objectives will have controls, which are those checkpoints that you can check for. Jay, so ISO 27001 is a framework. PCI DSS is a framework. They're not controlled. They're not a checkpoint. So they actually, and we will come to that when we look at information security policies, but they actually provide the framework of what you need to do, and they give you, in fact, a list of controls. So overall, you have and I think Vaibhav, in some ways, this might also answer your question, right? So there are, of course, generic controls, and these generic controls are at a very high level, aligning with the organization goals. So again, going back to our Paul O'Neill example, how can you have generic controls that ensure that we are a zero injury company, right? And therefore, what are all those generic controls that you need to have in place so that you could ensure that that mission is actually accomplished? IT application controls, on the other hand, are, and Weber, to your question, so you could actually have controls within IT applications, which are checkpoint procedures that can actually be used to ensure that business applications, so you don't actually have to do it manually, right? So these are actually monitored by systems, and you can create, various logs and audit trails of the implementation of those controls, and therefore you could evidence those controls directly from the system itself. Right. So, any other questions? We'll just quickly move on to risk assessment. So again, in risk assessment, we will go through assessment analysis and treatment. We will look at what are assets, threats, vulnerabilities, etc. And we will also briefly look at qualitative versus quantitative risk analysis. Right. So now looking at so what is risk? Um, so yes, Satish, absolutely. CISA is definitely one of the quote unquote gold standards for audit roles, right? Especially if you're specifically interested in audit as opposed to other aspects of information security. Right. Let's look at information security risk. So, what is risk? Risk is basically nothing but the likelihood of something happening. Um, so, and when you say the likelihood of something happening, then you also want to know if that something happened, what is the impact of that something happening. So, if there is a likelihood of, for example, having loss of electricity here in this area, then what is the impact of that on me as a person, right? Exactly. Yes, its impact on property. So the third aspect to risk is also understanding what is the vulnerability in the system, because a lot of times you have things in your system that in some ways can help you reduce that impact on your system of the risk if it happens. So we will when we go through some of these slides, we will actually get more acquainted with it. So basically, it is that the damage that the potential damage that IT systems face, um, and it is a combination of the impact that it has on that IT system and the likelihood of it happening. And it is very important to develop a methodology. And what I will do during the course of these next few slides is give you some sense of a methodology, right? I've tried to kind of create a methodology around it, which can be used, and you could potentially take that as input and grow it into something more meaningful. The other thing that we need to ensure that we keep in mind is, a lot of times when we say information security risk, people tend to look at it as merely as confidentiality, right? So as in, people say, information security risk would mean that this pharmaceutical company and their formula should not be compromised, because then it's an information security risk. But it is not only that; it is also, if you look at it from the CIA triad perspective, it is also an issue with integrity and availability. So we will talk about that also. Now, when you do a risk assessment, context is very important. If we go back to our Paul O'Neill example, so he said zero injury company. Now, zero injury company by itself doesn't mean anything unless you can put context around it and say, okay, zero injury company, which means I want to ensure that this has positive impact on on productivity, and therefore, if the productivity improves, the quality of my products improve, and if the quality of my products improve, I get access to a better market, and if I get access to a better market, obviously I can reach better, larger sort of consumers, and therefore improve consumer confidence, and therefore become, the company I want to become, right? So there is an entire context around this, and it is important to understand that context. Otherwise, risk assessment will be not just incomplete; it would actually be irrelevant. The next step is then identifying the risks to this context. So given this context, what are the various risks to this system? Then once you've identified those risks, you then analyze the risks, and you say, as I said, I have tried to put some method to the madness in terms of a methodology. So maybe we can use that, and you analyze it and evaluate it. Once you evaluate it, you treat it. There is something called as the 4 Ts. I'm sure a lot of them would be, I'm sure we have come across the 4 Ts of treatment. Then eventually you review and monitor it to make sure. So, if you go back to our Paul O'Neill example, ultimately you need to ensure that it is a zero, um, injury company, right? I mean, you can do all this, but if you don't review and monitor, then ultimately at the end of the quarter you find out that you've actually not accomplished your mission, and there is actually more reputation risk than with you not saying anything at all. So like I said, context. So what are the organizational priorities, right? So you come from that point of view. It's a top-down approach. So what are the existing issues? Who are the key internal and external stakeholders? What is their expectation from all of this? And what is the risk appetite of the organization? In this case, Paul O'Neill was very clear, right? Zero, right? Um, and what is the importance of various information assets in the context of the organization's mission, vision, goals? So, it is possible to, document all of this. And Jay, you're right? So you can actually put it into some kind of a scoring mechanism. So, for example, you look at, for example, you take information assets, something like a backup media. Backup media confidentiality score may not be very high, as it's fast information, but it needs to have reasonably accurate information. But availability has to be very, very strong, right? At the point in time that you need that information for you to be able to restore it, it needs to score very high. Likewise, people assets. So I've just taken the CFO group, for instance, right? Confidentiality there is reasonably high, right? Because they deal with numbers, etc. So you need to make sure that that team is able to keep confidentiality, as a very high priority. Integrity is, critical, right? I mean, you can't be going around giving wrong numbers. And availability again needs to be very high, because at the end of the day they are responsible for the monetary health of the company. So so I've tried to chart some of these in place, right? And this kind of gives a way to and a lot of this right now what we're doing is truly qualitative risk analysis, right? So it is not quantitative in any sense of the word. So it gives us a way to put method to the madness for qualitative analysis as well, right? So so when you say qualitative, you're not just saying, oh, the risk is high or low, but you're actually able to somehow give it a more solid foundation. So you identify all the threats. You look at the probability of these threats occurring, and then you look at any existing vulnerabilities in the system, and you look at the impact of a compromise if one of these were to happen, right? So even threats, you could actually calculate it based on some of these factors, right? So you can actually look at threats and say, is this a financial threat? Is this a threat to my ability to continue doing services? Is this a compliance threat? Will I be found non-compliant because of this, or will this cause reputation risk? And you could actually, therefore, also once again create, some kind of a matrix that allows you to use these parameters and rate your threats as well as critical, high, medium, low, etc. And finally, when you come to qualitative risk analysis, I'll just go to the next slide, because I think that should. Sorry, it is further down. Now, so basically, what this is trying to do is use some kind of a method, even though it is qualitative, to put everything in perspective and have a way to methodically, categorize your risks. You can do the same thing through quantitative risk analysis, right? Which is obviously a very numerical uh, affair, meaning that you could look at your asset value, say for example your building, and say, hey, this is a, let's proceed. So that was qualitative. So the idea of qualitative was to find some method to, at the end of the day, as the name suggests, qualitative, you're not obviously trying to use numbers, but what would be good is to be able to know what are your critical risks, what are your risks that are high or medium, and then what are the low risks, so that you could then figure out a way to proceed with your treatment options, right, of all these risks, even if they are qualitatively measured. Quantitative, on the other hand, uses numbers, and these numbers then give you numerical sense as to where what is your risk, and once you have a numerical sense, you can then decide, is this high, medium, low, critical, or whatever. Right? So if that risk is going to cost you $1 million, then it's probably critical. If that risk is going to cost you about $10,000, maybe not as critical. And if it is going to cost you $500, then you might be like, yeah, I don't really care about this risk. So these are just two approaches to analyzing your risks. And yes, I'm coming to that. So, and effectively, if you look at how we could arrive at numerical values, so exposure factor basically represents, how much of the value of the asset would you lose should that incident occur. Meaning, for example, if you're in an earthquake-prone area and you have a building which you spent I don't know $1 million to build, and if the assessment made by various engineers, etc., tell you that if there is an earthquake, you will definitely lose the top 3 floors of the 6-floor building, which means that you will lose, parts of your building. You will also lose some other connectivities and whatnot. So it is possible to estimate that you would lose about 50% of your asset. So your exposure factor is 50%. Should an earthquake occur in this area, your exposure to that earthquake is 50% of your assets, right? Now, the single loss expectancy is, if that earthquake occurred once, then you lose 50% of your asset, right? If that earthquake, so if you have two, and then you rebuild that building, and then if that earthquake occurred again you will lose 50% of your asset. So every time that incident occurs, you will lose 50% of your asset, which means you will lose 50% of your asset value. That is what your single loss expectancy is. Your annualized rate of occurrence is, okay, now if an earthquake occurs, then I will lose 50% of my asset value, which is fine. But how often does an earthquake actually occur in this place? And then the engineers come back and they tell you, hey, look, what, based on various history, blah, blah, whatever, previous occurrences and all that, it occurs once in 10 years. So, which means every year I have a 10% chance of that single loss, right? The single loss, which was 50% of my assets, every year there is a 10% chance of that 50%. So, which means that, if my building cost me about $1 million to make or build, my exposure factor is 50%, so therefore it is $500,000 is my single loss expectancy. So every time there's an earthquake, I lose $500,000. Annualized rate of occurrence is, because the earthquake only happens once in 10 years. Every year, I'm exposing myself to that possibility of losing $500,000, right? So since it occurs only once in 10 years, it is a tenth of that $500,000, which is basically $50,000. And that, which is basically your annualized loss expectancy. So your annualized loss expectancy is basically your single loss expectancy into your annualized rate of occurrence. An annualized rate of occurrence in our case was once in 10 years, so it's actually 0.10, right? So obviously we've been going through this example So ultimately, the point of all of this, whether you sit there and do complex calculations or you sit down and try and figure out criticality, etc., is to figure out what is your risk appetite, right? Or what is the organization's risk appetite. That is the ultimate goal, right? And what you could potentially do is, therefore, map this in terms of impact versus likelihood, and then start putting your buckets into, your risks into various buckets. Whether you have evaluated those risks qualitatively or quantitatively, you should still be able to put them into these buckets. And this gives you a map of how you could potentially then decide what is the appetite based on whatever it is. So anything that is in this high and crimson red area is probably not part of the risk appetite at all, right? Something has to be done about those. While some of these at this lower end, where the impact is negligible and the likelihood is absolutely rare, you could probably ignore, saying, anyway, if it happens, I don't lose anything, so it doesn't matter. So if ultimately you're able to bucket your risks into matrix like this, can then be used to actually make some decisions around risk. We then move to risk treatment. Right. So I will come to that. So risk appetite is a general English word. It basically it doesn't have, so tolerate comes from this, the 4 T's of risk treatment. This is where your tolerance is, which is basically the risk that you're willing to accept, right? So risk treatment has 4 different methods to it. So the first golden rule of risk is that you cannot eliminate risk, right? There is no way to eliminate risk. You can only mitigate risk. So as we go through, the treatment options, you will begin to realize what is tolerance, right? So the first treatment option is to avoid, or in the 4T parlance, that is actually terminate. Now, what does terminate actually mean? What it means is, the only way you can eliminate a risk is to not have that risk at all, meaning you don't do it at all. Which means, if somebody tells you, hey, if you build your building here, exactly, if they say, if you build your building here, there is a chance of, if there is an earthquake, there's a 50% exposure factor, which means you will lose $500,000. But it only happens once in 10 years. So you could say, you know what? To hell with you and your earthquake. I don't want to even build the building here. I'll go find a place where there is no earthquake ever, right? And that's the only way you can avoid a risk, is by not doing it at all, right? You terminate the entire idea. You terminate the operation. You terminate anything to do with building that building. The other thing that you could use as a treatment option is transfer the risk. What that means is basically, put the monkey on somebody else's head. So an example of that would be insurance, which is, you basically say, okay, if I'm going to lose 500,000, although I don't know if I will, we don't know if there's an earthquake that is going to happen, but let me insure it so that in the event that it will happen, then somebody will pay me the money for this. So you transfer the risk onto someone else. But if you remember that, while you have transferred the risk, the accountability is still with you. You cannot take away the accountability by transferring the risk onto someone else. The third thing is reduce the risk. So in this case, like in this example of earthquake, you could potentially say that, look, you know what, let us build railings around this building or whatever, so that when that earthquake happens, this building becomes can withstand it. It becomes self-sustainable to earthquakes, which means that yes, there is a risk of an earthquake, but if I can build guardrails around it and make it earthquake-proof, then hey, why not? And that is a reduction of risk. And you should be aware of that. Any reduction of risk actually means that there is a cost involved. But there are, of course, best practices that you could go to, etc. Right? And the last bit is accept. So this is where your tolerance comes into, right? Which is to say that now you've done everything that you could. So what you could avoid, you avoided. What you could transfer, you transferred. What you could reduce, you reduced. Right? Now, whatever is left, that is tolerance. That is your risk tolerance. That is the risk that you accept, and you're willing to put your neck out for it. Right? So, in this case, for example, you didn't want to avoid building the building because the location was right for you. So, therefore, you transferred and you put some insurance company to work on it. You also build guardrails around the building as part of the construction itself, so that if there is an earthquake, it self-sustains. Now, whatever is the risk that is left, so your exposure factor may have gone down from 50% to maybe 5%, which means you may lose 5% um, of your assets. That's your tolerance. You're willing to take it. Right now, let's go to controls, right? And I think this might answer your question also there. So there are three main types of controls, and this is true not just for risk, it is true for practically every project that we do in life. Sorry, is there a question? So this is true for practically every project that we do in life. So practically everything revolves around people, person, and technology. In this case, there are also physical controls that we need to put in place. I think someone's mic is on. So what you can do is you can rate them based on their significance from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective. So, for example, let's look at caterers. Confidentiality. I mean, how confidential is the menu, right? I mean, that is an information asset. There is a daily menu. How confidential is the daily menu? Not really confidential. From an integrity perspective, how important is it the daily menu is accurate and it should reflect the food that is there? Half the times, there is, half the times there is, this something on the board and something else in the plate. But availability, you may say, you want it on time. It may not be low, but it is medium. So, you could take every aspect of a program or a project, and you could then create a tabulated view of it, where you say, look, from a CIA perspective, this is how I rank them. And then eventually, you take the highest score of the three, right? And you could then use that to decide whether it is a low, medium, high, or a critical risk. Risk, the controls could also be, of course, physical, right? So when it comes to people, the controls could be things like, how do you ensure that the right people are doing the right kind of stuff? How do you ensure separation of duties? These are all various controls that you do to ensure that information is is of high integrity, is highly available, and confidentiality is maintained. Likewise, from a technology perspective, physical, we've all seen it, where you have swipe badges, you have turnstiles, you have all kinds of anti-tailgating and piggybacking solutions and whatnot. But of course, depending upon the type of program or project, people, technology, and physical controls will vary. And eventually, when we come to information security policy, we will see some of these things. So, like I said, ultimately, you need to, monitor this. If you go back to our Paul O'Neill example, so it's all well and good to say zero injury company, who's monitoring that and who's reviewing it day on day, month on month, quarter on quarter, year on year. So obviously, when a mission like that is percolated down the company and the GRC teams and others work on it, you may have identified the various risks, injury risks or what have you, and you may have put controls in place, but unless you keep periodically monitoring it and reviewing it, you wouldn't know if those controls are working or not. So you need to monitor the environment for any change. So for example, in our Alcoa example again, for only, if the aluminum industry has changed or they've started using new manufacturing methods, then that changes everything, and you need to go back and evaluate if your GRC procedures and therefore your GRC operations and the technology underlying it, they're still applicable. Likewise, organization. If Paul O'Neill himself leaves, the next guy who comes in and says, "This is all shit. We don't want to worry about worker safety anymore. Can we just start focusing on quarter-on-quarter revenue?" And suddenly the whole GRC is turned upside down. But on the other hand, you also have to look at, how do we create an organization that is, reviewing all of these changes in a proper way. So, for example, how are risk registers maintained? How are injuries documented? How are the controls that affected those injuries reviewed? And therefore, how do they go back up the chain to senior management and then come back as actions and so on? Framework, so as far as injuries are concerned and manufacturing industries are concerned, I'm sure there are laws and regulations that prevail, right? That say that these are the safety nets that every manufacturing organization should have. Of course, Paul O'Neill went way beyond what some of these regulations may say. Exactly, OSHA use. The other one that you could think of is with the airline industry. Pilots who have flown for X number of hours, they have to be off air for 24 hours or whatever before they can fly again, or 48 hours or whatever the regulation is. So these frameworks are based on policies, procedures, and industry best practices, which are all taken into account. And these should be used when you review and monitor your your risk environment. And finally, KPIs. In our Paul O'Neill case, it was 0 injuries. Now, are we doing 0 injuries per month, or have we got injuries? If we've got injuries, then why do we have it? What is the governance function doing, and why are we not able to achieve our goals? Weber, I think crypto policies is something that we probably have to have a separate discussion. I think nobody really knows what these policies are. Let the policies come out. But at the moment, these policies are vague at best. There is an entire world of CBDCs, or what are called as central bank digital currency, which are all in the works, and I think those will define policies. It depends, Jashu, right? I mean, see, now, could you achieve the same performances in Alcoa without having that 0 injury policy? Potentially, you could, right? Would those risks continue to exist? Yeah, maybe. There could have been other ways of achieving the same result. There are multiple ways of slicing a pie. So I wouldn't necessarily go to the extent of tying the two together with a knot. But it is fair to say that your KPIs, at the end of the day, if you have done a significant risk analysis, it is fair to say that it has to result in something, whatever that thing is, and the only way to measure that is KPIs. So, so review, as I said, it's a continuous process. So you have to monitor it month on month, quarter on quarter. You report these as well. And you know, we saw the matrix with the low, high, etc. The very colorful matrix. Now that is the one that you need to constantly review to make sure that those highs start slowly transitioning towards green. Now, privacy impact assessments. So why does it matter? What is PII? And we look at some step-by-step processes for this. So any questions thus far? Okay. So the problem with privacy, it is very difficult to actually define privacy, because what is privacy for me may not be privacy for you, and vice versa. I want to actually give an example for this, much like our Paul O'Neill example. For those of you who are in Europe and Singapore, etc., I don't think we follow this so strictly in India. But if you walk into the supermarket, the first thing you will likely see are vegetables. And this is because in the 90s there was, economists and statisticians love to create all this correlations, right? And they usually create these correlations using statistical data. Not always are these correlations correct, but a lot of times they do get it right. So what effectively happened was, in the 90s there was this a lot of research done on how could retail organizations become more relevant to the public in the area, and online hadn't really taken off at that time. So one of the things that supermarkets found was that if people buy the healthy stuff first, then they're more than happy to splurge on cookies, which means, if you put the cookies at the back of the supermarket and put the veggies in the front, and actually it defies logic, because if the veggies are at the front of the door is always opening, closing, so the veggies are exposed to the to the weather and all kinds of temperature changes, etc. So you have to work really hard to keep them fresh. But the understanding was that if I keep veggies in the front and cookies at the back, people tend to, by the time they get to the back, they're so happy with all the healthy shopping they've done, they're willing to splurge on the cookies. So this became like the, if I would say, the de facto cookie cutter structure of all supermarkets. And if you go to most supermarkets, you'll observe this. Now, this is very high level PIS, and it's a very high level view of the world. It doesn't get too personal for you and I, so it's still okay. But then, retailers as well as economists and statisticians realize that this one-size-fits-all solution doesn't help, because not everyone thinks that way, and this is probably not really helping drive the business. So they went to the next level and they said, when do people's buying habits really change? And they realized that, when there are large occurrences in people's lives, buying habits change. Meaning that, for example, and I'm sure this has happened to all of us, if you get married, your buying habits change. Meaning that, for example, you buy a different brand of rice, or for single guys, maybe, you were swigging all the while and suddenly you're at the supermarket. So, all the money that used to be going to Swiggy is suddenly going to supermarkets, right? So there's a huge shift in buying pattern. So these significant occurrences in life actually change buying pattern. Now, I want to use an example. There was a statistician by the name of Andrew Pohl. Andrew Pohl was not only a very good statistician, he was also, an enthusiastic computer programmer. So evil of both worlds. Anyway, so he used to work for Target, and one of the things that while this was going on, Target figured that there is a huge shift in buying pattern when women are pregnant, which is quite normal, because after you have the baby, then you buy a pram, you buy Pampers, you start buying more clothes, suddenly you're feeding more, so there's a huge shift in buying pattern. So many companies, including Target, they realized that if I could find out if any of my consumers are pregnant, then I could actually approach them before the others and give them coupons and whatnot, and I could potentially make hay before everyone else in the sun. So Andrew Paul, being a computer programmer, also started figuring out some kind of a program logic for this. And he said, you know what, I'm going to even figure out which trimester my customer is. And this was all without getting into actually who the person is and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you have to. And what they were doing is they were sending out these coupons to, especially to women when they were in their last trimester, so that they would be, you know, um, encouraged to come to Target and buy their pants. And Target also realized that new parents who come to Target to buy a pram also do their entire household shopping as well, because they don't want to go to a separate place to do the household shopping. So there was a lot of cross-selling opportunities, upselling opportunities, and whatnot. So they started tracking this. But of course, our man Andrew Paul was more of a enthusiast programmer, not a professional guy. And one of these coupons or what have you ended up at the home of a high school girl. And the father was absolutely livid because he came to Target and he goes like, "What are you in some ways encouraging my child to become pregnant and buy, Pampers and prams and whatnot? I mean, what the hell is wrong with you people? Why would you send coupons in the name of my child?" And obviously something had gone terribly wrong. So um, so therefore, what effectively happened was, Target said, "Look, we apologize. Our program went wrong. We will, compensate whatnot." And they pacified the father and sent him home before he sued Target. A month later, when the manager of Target actually called the father to see if everything is okay, the father then replied to him and told him, "Look, there were some things happening in my house that I was not aware of." You see, now this has got into PII territory, right? So somewhere along the line of just trying to be prepared for better business, we lost the line between wanting to build better business and infringing into the rights of people. That is why privacy matters. So whether that child had been abused or whatever happened to that child, Target had no business knowing that information. So therefore, you see, it is not possible to define privacy, but what is possible is to define unauthorized access to any information that I have. And that is what really privacy works on. Privacy works on making sure um, that we are working on not allowing information to be compromised. So the whole idea of developing cybersecurity strategies and the stuff that we're doing is all to prevent unauthorized access to all kinds of information. So what is personally identifiable information? So in the case of course, this young child and our friend Andrew Paul, they obviously somehow had access to name and address because they were in the local vicinity. They had some access to dates, and while in this case they may not have had access to any government ID and account numbers and employee numbers. Clearly, those are not anybody else's business than the person's. So how do you do PIA? So what is PIA? PIA is basically ensuring that the system doesn't infringe upon some of this personally identifiable information. That you don't make programs that our friend Andrew Paul made and get into the lives of other people uninvited, right? So you identify these systems and you define boundary conditions where you have to stop somewhere. You started by saying that put the veggies in the front and the cookies in the back, and people will buy more, and that was fine. But when you started uh, targeting and monitoring health of your customers kind of are somewhere crossing the line. Data items. So what are those data items that are being recorded in the application? When you do a data flow analysis, you see where all this data is going and what all it is touching. I actually want to give an example here. This is from a book that I was reading. Are you able to see the screen? This is an example of the kind of information that our friend Andrew was able to pick up from from various customers, right? And this is a data flow analysis that that should have been done by somebody who was involved in the general risk scheme of things and said, hey, you know what, you're crossing many boundaries here, right? So anyway, so you do a data flow analysis. You identify privacy risks, and then you figure out remediation for it. So personal information is is becoming more and more. I would say it's becoming more and more. The word I would say is top of the table. Right? People are beginning to talk about this, especially in Europe. So Muthu, I think that is best answered by somebody like Proud or somebody. So Jay also has some answers. So any questions on PIA? Right. Let's go to cloud security fundamentals. And I think we have about 15 odd minutes left. But let's try to blitz through whatever we can. Right. So in cloud security, we'll look at cloud computing, look at design and deployment of cloud solutions, look at cloud data and application security around it, and we look at some cloud operations concepts as well. So cloud computing, right? So the idea is to, on demand, I could get more RAM, I could get more hard disk space, I could get more computing power. So cloud computing is enabling network access to a scalable and elastic pool of shareable resources. And then eventually we added self-service and administration capability. Right? Any cloud didn't really have that. So Amazon was the earliest to offer this. I don't know if any of you have come across merchant.com, that is pre-AWS days, and they still lead the way in a lot of ways. So a lot of the standardization, automation, etc., has been Amazon innovation. So deployment models, I think you're aware of different cloud architecture. So the deployment models are differentiated by really who owns the resources, who are the people that it is shared with, then whose responsibility is it for the security in the cloud, and whose responsibility it is to manage the security of the cloud. So in public cloud models, so your GCP or Google Cloud Platform, AWS, or these which are all basically public cloud models. You have so the resource is owned by the service provider, which is Amazon. It is shared with any customer. There is Amazon doesn't differentiate between customers. Security in the cloud is the customer's responsibility, right? So, for example, if you take Amazon Web Services to run an application, the application security and whatnot is not Amazon's responsibility; it's your responsibility. Security of the cloud, as in, nobody will hack into the cloud and whatnot, is Amazon's responsibility. So even if something happens, the responsibility is with them. Remember, the accountability is still with you. That never goes away. Private cloud, so the resources are owned by customers. So, for example, if it is within a banking premises or what have you, then it's owned by customers. It is owned by the bank. It's a private cloud, so it is not shared. And the customer is fully responsible for the cloud as well as the applications that are on the cloud. The hybrid model is becoming quite popular. So, depending upon, the type of information that an application is using, and we can evaluate the type of information using your CIA tribe, to say, what is not entirely too confidential can be on a public cloud, what is confidential it could be in a private cloud. And community clouds, community clouds are, I would say they're a form of private cloud, but they include several organizations rather than being part of just one organization. So typically, governmental organizations use this, or even UN, right? So UN has so many different businesses or organizations. We call them businesses, but organizations. So you have the Security Council, you have the UNHCR, which is the humanities side of the organization. Then you have the UN General Council, so on and so forth. So there could be a community cloud that takes care of just all the UN organizations across the board. Right? So those are the various deployment models used to it. I just thought, trends would be interesting in terms of, who are the front runners in cloud deployments. Some of the observations that that you could make out of, not just this deployment trend, but also over the last couple of years and how the world has changed. So, hybrid and multi-cloud are growing. COVID-19 has obviously accelerated the use of cloud. We are a good example of it. We wouldn't have been doing virtual meetings if it wasn't for COVID-19. So people have begun to use the cloud several percentage points more. Even today, cost optimization is the key driver for everything that happens in the cloud. So Google is the leader in public cloud, obviously, because they have the Google Suite. AWS is the leader in enterprise cloud. Azure is the leader in private cloud, but that is, again, only obvious because, most organizations still run on Windows, and Linux and Mac are still kind of with more service providers, etc. So you tend to have Windows servers and clients and whatnot, and therefore Azure makes for an automatic choice. Interestingly, so a lot of these cloud platform providers also provide services. So it's not just cloud. So you have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, you have software as a service, and so many other things that you get from it. IoT platform as a service has been the fastest growing area, which I thought was interesting. So generalized use case for cloud data security, right? So generally, this is how data works. I mean, it's a very generalized use case for data. So data is created, whether you create a file or then it is effectively stored somewhere in the cloud, and then it is used, and eventually at some point you archive it or share it. And when all is said and done, you destroy it. This is the life cycle of most data. So that basically creates data in 3 stages in all of this. It is either in use, in transit, or in motion, or it is at rest. So therefore, data security in cloud has to address each one of these states of the data. So at rest, you're talking about encryption, right? So typically, you would encrypt your files. You also get hardware encryption. Digital rights management, which is used to, in some ways, identify ownership. It's not been very successful. Neither has NFTs, for everyone claiming that DRMs will be replaced by NFTs. And of course, it is at rest, so you tend to have some kind of endpoint DLP solution, especially if it is confidential data, so that it doesn't travel. And then since it's on the cloud, several types of CASB solutions that you can use. You could complement that with the DLP and use it. So data in transit, again, encryption. So all of your private key and public key communication that happens is for data that is moving. Manage file transfer protocols, which allow you to again securely transfer files. And there again, your endpoint DLPs and CASBs. And finally, for data in use, while obviously access control is the only way to ensure the security of data, but there are encryption solutions, that modern day encryption solutions that allow you to use encrypted data as well. So while from an exam perspective, I'm not 100% sure that would be the right answer, but it is important to know that there are encryption solutions that are working on, and there are modern day encryption solutions that are working on data in use. That can use data that is encrypted to do, for example, mathematical calculations. So cloud infrastructure security. So security in the cloud. So in the cloud, you need to think about, for example, if you're running applications in the cloud, then what happens if the cloud service is not available? So you need to look at things like disaster recovery and business continuity. And of course, all of the infrastructure that goes along with it. And security of the cloud is, really your data centers and, boundary protection, meaning, it is fenced and, it's not exactly accessible, and then, ensuring asset security. So they're all in rails and they're locked and whatnot. So obviously, security of the cloud is taken care of by cloud providers, public cloud environment, private cloud environment, obviously the bank or whoever is the company that is using a private cloud will have to ensure this. Now, application security in the cloud. Now that is, run out of policies, procedures, controls, technologies, as we saw in IT audit, right? So there's a whole set of controls and policies that we put in place. So I'm going to just list down a whole set of security controls that you can put in there, and how those could potentially be used. So, the threat modeling that we did earlier, where we were looking at various risks and figuring out how to, manage those risks, etc. And there are other, obviously, forms of threat modeling that can be done. Training and awareness to ensure that people don't misuse the system. Secure software development lifecycle, and also security by design, using good source code management techniques. Secure APIs, using cloud access brokers, as well as platforms that are service brokers, as well as service platforms that are now coming up, which provide you a wider array of services than just broker. Using identity and access management solutions. So yeah, I mean, a whole list of security controls that are in place for applications. So with that, we come to information security, and it's a good segue also. Actually, what happened was, the cloud became my problem, as this whole thing was on OneDrive, and somehow OneDrive managed to wipe out my PPT. So the rest of it is going to be from my PDF, but all that you will lose is all the animation, but the data is there. So I'm just going to switch to that PDF if that's okay. Meanwhile, any questions? All right, so information security policy. So we look at information security policy in general, and then we will look at organization level policies and program level policies, etc. So I think this is a good point to talk. Good time to actually talk about 27001. So 27001 is currently the most popular framework for security certification. And there was of course ISO 9000, and there was 14,000. The current fashionable certificate is 27001. 27001 includes Annex A, and somebody was asking about application controls, right? So Annex A actually includes about 114 controls, right? And that can be used to tailor your own ISMS implementation to align with this framework. Yes, correct. It has been reduced to 93, but then again, 27002 is taken those 93 and made it quite interestingly complex as well. But never mind. Suffice to know that 27002 gives you guidelines on how to implement those controls. So let's come to that in a bit further. So let's just run through some of this. I think we're probably jumping the gun. Let's run through some of this, and then we will come to how these are applied and where these are applied, and you will actually realize it as you go through this. Right? So, so 27001 is a full framework ISMS for organizations, and it is supplemented with 27002, which provides the guidelines. So 27,000 gives you general overview, terms and conditions, etc. Sorry, terms and definitions, etc. 27,003 gives you guidance for implementing ISMS. The difference is 27,002 gives you only guidance for the Annex A, right? 27,003 is for the entire 27,001. So 27,004 gives you guidance on monitoring and performance measurements. 27,005 guidance on risk management. 27,006 on audit and certification. And 27,007 on how to audit an ISMS. And there is also specific guidelines for for specific industry verticals. So, for example, 27,015 is literally 27,001, but tailored for financial services. So, information security. We spoke about this CIA triad so many times. Probably makes sense to have the CIA triad. Before that, let me address Vaibhav's question, right? So, Vaibhav, as I was saying, and I wish I had the animated one, right? Because then it would have been clear. I just hate this PDF version before they live it. But there are specific 27,000 guidelines for for specific industries. So it varies across industries. So if you're for example a medical institution versus you're a financial services institution or what have you, so there are different IEC variants of the 27,001 for enterprise. When it comes to startups, it really depends on the startup business, and they have to really do an assessment of what is the kind of framework that they should adopt based on the business model that they're getting into. A lot of times, startups may not have that clarity as to what are they, right? Until they've reached a certain size. And I think at that point, they would be able to actually do an assessment. That is true. That is true, Chandan. So there are several fully automated tools that do this. Yes. So right. So let's get back to the CIA tribe. So the idea is, so information security is, how do you prevent unauthorized access? And we spoke about how privacy cannot be defined, but what we want is prevention of unauthorized access, and not have too many of these Andrew polls going around doing. Doing all kinds of analytics on our personal data. Right? So preventing unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, inspection, recording, and all disruption of that. So some terms and conditions. What is an information asset? It is any information that is hardware or software that is valuable to the organization or to an individual for that matter. Risk is the likelihood of something happening to this information and the compromise of that information. Right? Risk management, vulnerability, and threat we've already come across. So key drivers for an ISMS system, and why would we want to do information security management, right? So this again goes back to your question, Bhargav, right? So you need to look at these drivers, especially as a startup, and see how this impacts you. So there are several. So I think these headings are swapped. So there are external drivers. These external drivers include things like legislation. So like we spoke about the aviation example, right? So the aviation industry has certain guidelines in terms of saying, if a pilot has already flown for 36 hours in a week, then he has to take 48 hours break or whatever. Now, Singapore Airlines might actually go and say, what, me being Singapore Airlines and my routes normally being quite long and distant, I go to Australia or UK or India and whatnot. So my pilots doing 36 hours is not the same as European pilots doing 36 hours, by going between, let's say, Germany and France and UK. Those are all short flights. So therefore, I will not go with 36. I will go with some other different number which is larger than what is minimum specified. So there are several drivers that you could decide how your information security management is done. Right? So legislation may be one, social, cultural, financial may be another, political, economic. So these are some of the external drivers. So internal drivers are structure of the organization, governance, objectives. Objectives are linked directly to mission vision goals. So like our Paul O'Neill example, which spoke about zero engineering. Then whatever resources that are available, so that also is a driver to the kind of information system management that you do. Sorry, information security management that you do. Then the culture, standards and contracts obviously come from external drivers. And then the stakeholders. So who are all your clients, your customers, consultants, and audit bodies, and what are their suggestions? So all of these actually result in the ISMS framework that you implement. So information security is the practice of preventing unauthorized access, as we saw earlier. Information policy is derived from laws and regulations, like in the case of aviation industry and the pilots. Now, the information security policy, which is an amalgamation of these two, is how do you take those industry rules and regulations and your own policy and amalgamate it, and then create security services around it to protect the sensitive and critical system resources that we have. So policy levels. We have organizational level policies. So these are defined at the organization level. So like in our Paul O'Neill case, at the organization level, it was decided, hey, look, zero injury company. So therefore, you start having your goals and objectives defined by these organization goals and objectives. You then create underlying ISMS systems aligned to these organization goals and objectives, and then you figure out how you will handle deviations. If there are, for example, in the following case, there are any injuries, then how do you manage those deviations? And obviously, the idea of managing those deviations is to prevent its recurrence. While at a program level, you obviously handle it with technology, right? You create the right kind of access controls, you create the right kind of classifications, you have physical and environmental security. So, in that speech, Paul O'Neill is telling them, like an airplane steward or stewardess, where is the exit row, right? And that has to become part of the policy eventually. Then you create, so it could also be simple program level policies, which are like, for example, clear desk policies. Or it could be even, the cloud level, for example, what are the backup policies that you need. So there are organization level policies and there are program level policies. And obviously, every time there is an organizational level policy change, then that results in a program level policy modification and vice versa, right? So program level policies, when you start realizing that, this is constraining progress of a program, or it's constraining deliverables, then it might actually go back as a feedback to organizational level policies, and there may be considerations to review and perhaps even revise them. Strictest of regulations when it comes to data, and it has arisen from the kind of our statistician and an enthusiastic programmer Andrew Cole was not a malicious person, right? So it is not always malicious people who are trying to infringe upon your privacy and get unauthorized access to data. Sometimes it happens, without that maliciousness in mind. But the point is that it should not happen, and for it to not happen, there needs to be regulation, right? So, primary aim of GDPR is to enhance an individual's control over his or her personal data, so that, going back to the target example, that young child has the ability to get all of this data out of the system. So personal data is obviously, stuff like names, emails, IP, cookies, and whatnot. Sensitive personal data is, things like health. For example, pregnancy is also a health attribute, right? In some ways. So nobody has any business to know that unless they're actually told so, or there is any need to know for it. Likewise, racial origin, sexual orientations, all of these things, are really not part of public domain information and should not be, and people shouldn't have access to. So data and data complexity. So data. So all of this is data. Everything is data. So data complexity comprises of the 5 V's. Right? So you have velocity. How quickly this data is accumulating. Volume. How much of this data is accumulating. Variety. What different types of data is accumulating. For example, PDFs, videos, MP3 files. I know so many different varieties of data formats exist now. Right? Veracity refers to the quality of the data that is being accumulated, and value is, how much value does this data have. So in the case of Andrew Cole, that pregnancy data had a lot of value, right? Because it made target ready to and ready to kick off the minute that massive spending was expected to happen. Right? Processors and controllers. So data subject. Data subject is the individual whose data is under consideration. In this case, it was the young girl or a child who was a high school student. Basically. Personal data obviously refers to any of this data that helps identify that child. Data processing is obviously using that data to come up with this coupons and whatnot, right? Um, Data controller is um, the the product provider. In our example, it is actually Andrew Paul, right? The statistician and programmer who was the data controller. And the data processor was Target because they had basically used the services of Andrew Paul, right? Um, and done the quote unquote breach. And breach, of course, refers to unauthorized access to. So GDPR on the whole has, outlined several rights for the data subject. So the subject has the right to be informed. So in this case, the child and the family should have known that this kind of data has been collected. Two, the child should have had access to that data to see what the hell are they doing with my data. Now, while this may not be relevant in our example, but the right to rectification, and we all need it, right? So every now and then we change our phone numbers or some other personal information on Google or Twitter. Right to erasure, which is to be forgotten. Now in this case, things just went completely wrong, and that child's data should actually be erased, right? And she should have the right to get it erased. The right to restrict processing, right to data portability, which is if I want to move service providers, then I should be able to do that. Then the right to object, which is the first thing that should have been done. So instead of the father going there and saying, hey, you guys are in some ways encouraging my child to become pregnant, you should have been fighting and saying, why the hell did you even collect this data? So the right to object. And rights in relation to profiling. So there was some, in this case, while the profiling was done at a very high level, that is a group, as in pregnant women, and therefore it results in this kind of a change in business. But profiling could also happen at individual levels, and a lot of us who've been through courts would know that. So that's it. So principles of accountability for the targets of the work. Right? So this applies to them, which is the data that they collect should be lawful. It should be collected legally, fair and transparent. So we should be able to see what they're collecting and why. And that is why now you have a lot of places where they actually take your specific um, uh, consent as well, right? So it should be specific, it should be explicit, and it should be for legitimate purposes. So while the collection may have been legal, the use needs to be for legal purposes too. It should be adequate, relevant, and limited, which means that don't collect more data than you actually need to. It should be accurate and up-to-date, which means that make sure that if you're using my data and I've allowed you to use my data, that you keep it up to date, and don't keep it for any longer than I needed to keep it, and make sure that it is handled securely.